Hi everyone out there on Twitch, hope everyone's doing well. It's that time again, another recording of the Modern Meltdown podcast. I wasn't actually going to do another recording this week due to the fact that I thought I would be doing an interview. But instead, turns out that I'm going to be doing this new subject, and then next week we'll be doing an interview. So there won't be another stream next week. It's going to go back to our regularly scheduled program. So this week, what we're going to be tackling with the Modern Meltdown episode 24 is the rise of pop culture diversity. So in 2016 and 2017, it proved to be some of the biggest years for comic book properties in recent memory. Now, Black Panther has taken in already a staggering $700 million worldwide in just 2 weeks. Now, that's smashing box office records left and right, and while Wonder Woman herself trounced Man of Steel and Justice League in its box office when it came out in 2017. So the question is, why are diverse characters proving to be so popular in this day and age? Now, diversity has always proven to be popular, and you may be wondering what I'm talking about here, and I specifically think of things like Star Trek. Now, the original Star Trek, which starred William Shatner all the way back in the 60s, did something that no TV show had ever done before, and that was share the first interracial kiss between two characters. And the interesting story behind that as well is that William Shatner and I'm going to try to remember her name, Nichelle Nichols, they had been talking about this kiss, and they wanted to put it on the screen, and the people who worked on Star Trek at the time, the producers, were a little bit wary of this. Of course, 1960s were a very different time in the world, and what those two actors did is they framed the shot so that they had to use the kiss. So the compromise was that they would film the scene with the kiss and they'd film the scene without it. And the actors knew how to do their blocking in such a way that it would force the producers to use the cut of the kiss because the cut without the kiss wasn't going to work. And they did that on purpose. Star Trek was also a trailblazer for a lot of reasons. Star Trek had, as I said, with Nichelle Nichols, they had an African American. There was a Scotsman. Obviously, Scotty was running the warp drive. He was the engineer. You had a Russian in the form of Chekhov. And that was very interesting in itself, that the reason he was cast. He was a later addition to the crew. And this was around the real ramp up of the Cold War between the Americans and the USSR, the Soviet Union, which is now known as Russia, and a lot of those countries that belong to the SSR have now become their own states. And if you'd like to know more about that, use Google, because that's a very, very complicated situation. Now, the Russians said during that time that if Star Trek was meant to be portraying a utopia, how could it be this utopian vision of the future if there wasn't a Russian on board as well? And so the creators, who didn't, I imagine, didn't like being talked down to by the Soviet Union at the time, turned around and introduced a Russian character. So this was completely unprecedented, and this is, such a massive pop culture touchstone, Star Trek, the original series. Not just for science fiction, but I mean for the world at the time. It took people by storm, and so in that current landscape, it added so much diversity so quickly. And Star Trek would go on throughout its runs. We're talking Next Generation, Voyager, Deep Space Nine. In Deep Space Nine, the station is run by an African American captain. Once you get to Voyager, it's run. The Voyager is captained by a female character, and it's sort of an indicator of what pop culture has always, how tight it is with diversity. The ideals of the Federation in the Star Trek universe, you have diplomacy, cooperation, all in an expanding universe with a diverse population. Within the Federation, you have all of these different species working together towards one common goal. And there are no borders, there are shared resources, and predominantly the people on these ships, these starships, are explorers. They're not conquerors. They have weapons to defend themselves, but for the most part try and use diplomatic solutions to solve their problems. And so, for me, I think Star Trek was always such a massive cultural touchstone of diversity. And it's something that I always go back to. And like I said, they started in the 1960s. So, that question, why is diversity proving to be so popular today, considering the success of Wonder Woman and Black Panther, I would say that the reality is that it's always been part of the pop culture landscape. Diversity's always played that important part. Further examples of diversity in pop culture, we have Buffy the Vampire Slayer, a female protagonist. This show had a homosexual character with Willow identifying as a lesbian. This was, again, like when I was, I think maybe 12, 13, when Buffy first premiered, it was a show about this weird, lovable group of teenagers who always pushed for inclusion, who were the heroes of the story. The people who weren't were, the bad guys. You also had other massive sci-fi cultural touchstones like Alien, which was one of the first films to ever have a female protagonist as their central action figure. They often talk about how Ripley was the very first female action star. That Sigourney Weaver was that first action star. And so you look at those sort of films, they came out in the 1980s, respectively. You've got Terminator, that had Sarah Connor. And that's an amazing arc. If you watch Terminator 1 and 2, the originals, Sarah Connor is just a waitress. She's just getting by, likes to do everything that normal people do, and is suddenly thrown into this war. And by the time you get to Terminator 2, she is a battle-hardened military tactician, and the stark difference there is just incredible. And again, we're talking about diversity in film. Star Wars itself was also a trailblazer in a lot of ways. You had the late great Carrie Fisher, who was the rough and tumble princess, the leader, the commander. One of the scenes that stick out to me and will always stick out to me in that very first Star Wars film is the amount of guff that Princess Leia gives to Luke Skywalker and Han Solo when they first meet in that detention level. She takes command, she fires back, she makes fun of Luke's height when he's in the Star Trek uniform. The Star Wars Stormtrooper uniform. And then, even going forward into modern day, you do have shows like Game of Thrones, which feature an assortment of strong female characters. And obviously, Peter Dinklage, who I think is a tremendous actor, just from the work that I've seen him in Days of Future Past, X-Men, for example. He does wonderful in those sort of roles. And he is especially a fan favorite as Tyrion Lannister on Game of Thrones. And, he is a character that's put front and center even though within the universe that he lives in many times over, they describe him as not normal, as defective, as an abomination, and this character is the one that has risen from nothing and, you know, is such a player within the Game of Thrones universe. You know, and then again, like further still, there are a lot of science fiction and fantasy shows that always encapsulate a different group of people. The Lord of the Rings. I mean, I can go on and on, but hopefully I've proven my point here, is that diversity has always been an important part of pop culture right from the get-go, because I think with fiction, especially science fiction or fantasy, is that it's often when you're not talking about science fiction dystopias like Orwell's 1984 or Brave New World, you often see a future that, you know, we'd like to be in, or we're aiming for, going all the way back again to Star Trek. Star Trek is that show where it's an idealized utopian federation of explorers who all work together towards that common goal. And I think when Roddenberry was creating Star Trek, I think that he was making a comment on the possible future of humanity once we move past our biases and our prejudice. So yeah, science fiction has always had to take on a more realistic approach to the future and how we reach the stars if we don't pull together our collective resources. How does it happen without getting that diversity? Now this leads to, of course, further racial representation, and if you want your show to be successful, you have to appeal to every single household. Now I would like to make something very clear as well. Yes, you may have some really good intentioned people working on these properties, but diversity sells. You know, again, it's about putting backsides in seats at your local movie theater, and I think that's a very important point to raise as well. Is that the entertainment industry, the pop culture industry that we have, be it comics, be it TV, be it movies, the idea is to sell product. Unless you're, you know, an independent filmmaker who's possibly putting together a very small budget film that may never make a profit, that you may not ever be able to sell the rights to recoup some of your money that you've invested in it. It's a world where, sorry, 1 second, excuse me. Just had to clear my throat there. You have to be able to sell your product, and it's no... it seems funny in this day and age when people talk about diversity. They say, you know, why is there so much diversity in our pop culture? It makes absolute sense when you think you have to sell a product. So obviously you want to make sure that as many markets as possible are catered for. You know, we've seen the recent inclusion of a lot of Chinese production companies and Chinese actors in American produced films. Some are really good at including Chinese representation, because China in the last couple of years now has a booming theatre industry. For the longest time there were a lot of restrictions on what content the Chinese population were allowed to consume. And so a lot of these things have been lifted. Star Wars is a good example of that. It was banned. Well, not so much banned. It was definitely not circulated to the same extent it is now in China. And so, you know, you're seeing all these massive blockbusters go across the pond. And at least in the pond, as far as Australia is concerned. They're one of our neighbours in the oceanic region. But the point I'm trying to make with this is that because you now have this massive audience who is going to be pumping a lot of money into the box office, then you have to also represent them. You know, representation, people often use that in a very disparaging way, but representation is just, you know, you can imagine an African-American kid and he's watching Black Panther and he looks up at the screen and he's like, okay, they look like me. This is my this is my link to this helps me out, this helps me to understand the character. And so again, it's the same thing when you're talking about the Chinese film industry at the moment. You have the inclusion of more Chinese actors within the American movie making process. We're seeing that in Star Wars especially, that they're always looking at a bit of field to try and cast Chinese actors in those roles. I believe Rogue One had 2 Chinese actors, if I recall correctly. So, the less than, how should I put it? It's, the creative teams who put together these stories to try and include people, to try and increase diversity. Those people are very well intentioned. They're always trying to make sure that there's inclusivity within pop culture. The companies and the marketing executives, they're more interested in making a profit. The easiest way to do that is to make sure that as many people are catered for, as many people are represented as possible. And so that is why they do it. So, on one side of it, you have a very morally justified group of people who are trying to make sure that they get as many bums in seats. And then you've got the other group who are trying to change people's maybe thinking, maybe to present a more accurate landscape of diversity. Not only that, but we look at the television landscape at the moment, and there's definitely a mandate to reach more and more people, more and more audience members. You look at what the CW is doing at the moment. You have Flash, Arrow, Legends of Tomorrow, Black Lightning especially. All of these various superhero TV shows all include prominent African American characters, prominent Middle Eastern characters. Over on the Flash, you have Wally West, African American. You have, in fact, of course, the whole West family, all African American. Cisco, I believe, is of Latino descent. So you have this, this diverse cast. And then, Legends of Tomorrow, again, the captain of the ship, Sarah Lance, identifies as bisexual. Again, you've got characters like Constantine, Wentworth Miller's Captain Cold. All of these characters also have a diverse range of sexuality. Now, speaking of comics in particular, Marvel has been in and out of the pop culture news cycle, which I mentioned at the head of the episode, and that's concerning their approach to diversity. Now, older characters like Iron Man and Captain America are being replaced with new characters with more diverse backgrounds. I think of Riri Williams, aka Ironheart, or Falcon, taking up the mantle of Captain America. Now, there was some controversy last year when Marvel's Senior Vice President of Print, Sales and Marketing, David Gabriel, created an uproar after implying that the addition of racially diverse and female characters could have led to a sales decline. And he said, and I quote, what we heard was that people didn't want any more diversity. Gabriel told ICV2 after being asked what contributed to changes in customer taste that led to a drop in sales. They didn't want female characters out there. That's what we heard, whether we believe that or not. Quote unquote. Now, it would be foolish to not consider that Marvel's roots have always been in diversity, which is what helped them to build themselves into such a rival to DC Comics all the way back in the 70s. Daredevil was blind. The X-Men themselves were a metaphor for discrimination as a whole. And its rosters of heroes was pretty diverse at the time as well. You had Storm, African American, Jubilee, Asian American, Rogue, female, Jean Grey, again, main characters, female. Bishop, who was an Australian character. He was had Aboriginal heritage. And the X-Men's principal protagonist was Magneto, who was a Jewish Holocaust survivor. There were also a slew of other Marvel characters. You had Blade, you had Luke Cage, Jessica Jones, Miles Morales, and Avengers like Scarlet Witch, Black Panther, Black Widow. This isn't stuff that was new. This was stuff that was created all the way back when these characters first started appearing. Stan Lee is credited as one of the people who created Black Panther all the way back in the day. So it's always been there. I think people sometimes have this very condensed view of time. I have been on this planet nearly 30 years. This year is my 30th birthday. I know I have a certain segment of time. It's a very condensed history, especially when it comes to pop culture. But the bigger, the wider you broaden your scope for popular culture, you see the diversity has always been there. It's been there from day one. And that's why a lot of these things have been so popular. The topics that were discussed, after people were reading X-Men comics, I mean, at the time, you look at the ideologies that were going on, they often say that Magneto and Professor X are an analogy for Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and how they approach discrimination in the world. I mean, the X-Men is such a pop culture touchstone, and it's all about discriminating against a certain group of people because of attributes that they're born with. And it doesn't take an idiot to see just how relevant that still is today, and what they were trying to achieve at the time with those characters. To protect a world that hates and fears them, that was the slogan for the X-Men. Now, it should also be noted that DC was adding their own characters into the diversity mix. First and foremost is Wonder Woman, who has a long history with DC Comics, cemented in multiple comic books, TV show, and now, of course, a massively successful financial film. Wonder Woman is a very interesting character. Her creation, one of the creator of Wonder Woman, also worked on components that would go into making the light detector as well. He was a professor. There's a biopic that came out 2 years ago, I think, called something about the Wonder Woman women. It was released by Sony. You'd have to look it up. I can't remember it off the top of my head. But he had a very interesting view. He was a psychologist, as was his wife. And it was often suggested that they themselves were involved in a polyamorous relationship with other women, and that they had this sort of, ahead of its time family functioning unit where you had multiple partners, and you had everyone sort of being raised in this collective, which, when you talk about polyamory, is also something that is starting to become more and more talked about. Not so much accepted by mainstream, but definitely something that's more talked about. And you can see all of those influences put into the very early Wonder Woman comics. And so, Wonder Woman has become bigger than the brand. DC Comics has characters. I think when we think about like the Marvel stuff, they are firmly Marvel characters. You think of Iron Man, you think of Spider-Man. They are associated with Marvel. They are Marvel characters. But when you think about Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, these are characters that actually, in my opinion, transcend their brand. And that says volumes about Wonder Woman, that she also transcends her brand. Now, there were also storylines that were coming out from DC Comics. Green Lantern, Green Arrow They had a storyline called Hard Traveling Heroes, and that was written by Denny O'Neil. It was first published in 1983, and it took the cosmic characters and brought them down to Earth. They tackled social issues of the day, including inequality and drug addiction. Again, we're talking about 1983. The success of these storylines continue to this day, with Hard Traveling Heroes still in print. 35 years later, these stories are still resonating with audiences. You know, again, I mentioned that scope. You broaden out your scope, you can see why diversity has always been part of the landscape. And again, if you look at that very condensed timeline, if you look at your own personal timeline, it looks like there's suddenly this rise in diversity, but it's just not the case when you look at the history of popular culture. Now, the question at the top of this podcast, the question that I'm going to tackle now after, hopefully setting up some groundwork here, is why is diversity so popular? Now, I would wager, as I said, that diversity is a truer representation of the vast majority of people, at least in the Western world. New York City has a population of 8.5 million people from all different walks of life. Now, I would say you would be hard-pressed to find an office building without a diverse group of people when you have population numbers like that. For example, let's shrink the scale a little bit. My home city, Queanbeyan, which borders on the Australian capital of Canberra, its population is just over 350,000. That's the population of Canberra. Now, my workmates, because, other than jumping online and doing Twitch streaming and doing podcasts, I also, have a full-time job. And now my workmates are a mix of people from India, Nepal, the Philippines. This is also true for my wife and my brother, who both work with a bunch of different folks who immigrated from all over the world. And now the point I'm trying to make is that to get here, to get to the pop culture, be it comics or films, it needs to be relatable in order to be successful. Black Panther tapped into an untapped market of people. For the longest time, the African American population had very few on-screen heroes. So is it that much of a surprise that the community mobilizes to support this film and make their market share known? I'd like to leave that point out there for a little bit. It's really, really important to consider that there are millions of people who don't have a product for them. And when you do offer that product, they come out in droves to see it. It shouldn't be that much of a surprise to anyone. Now, the same absolutely happened for Wonder Woman. You had or female-only screenings. Now, I'm not going to talk about the controversies behind all of that crap. Some people obviously got upset about that, but that's not the point I'm trying to make here. The point is that there were enough people to fill female-only screenings of Wonder Woman. Again, you're tapping into that market. And when big companies, they get their hands on that sort of cash, they get their hands on that sort of popularity, what they're going to do is they're going to embrace it. And, they're going to be producing more content. Wonder Woman is a great example. You have a look at what's happened with the entire DC expanded universe. When you start with Man of Steel, Wonder Woman beat the box office for Man of Steel. Wonder Woman beat the box office for Justice League. In my opinion, Wonder Woman, Man of Steel are... I'd say Wonder Woman's a little bit better as far as the creative process goes, the flow of the movie, the way it was written. I think Man of Steel had a few little problems here and there, but relatively they're basic comic book movies. We don't need to put them on a pedestal, and they are very similar. But for Wonder Woman to absolutely trounce Superman, who is one of the oldest superheroes on the planet, again transcends the brain. And then when you put all those characters together in Justice League, and Justice League can't even get past the 700 million mark, and Wonder Woman beats it on her own, it says something about the untapped market that's out there as far as our diverse populations go. The question that some people like to raise, does the diversity in pop culture make for better pop culture? No, I don't think so. Just like a white or Caucasian-led film can be a hit and a miss, so can a diverse led film. Black Panther, I would rate above average. I gave it a 6.5 when I wrote my review for the modernmeltdown.com. It was definitely an above average movie. It's not my favorite Marvel film. My favorite Marvel film is Captain America Winter Soldier, which came out a couple of years ago now. And I still don't think I've enjoyed a Marvel film as much as I enjoyed that film. Catwoman. Let's talk about that. That has a diverse lead with Halle Berry. It's a dog shit movie. Even the writer just 2 weeks ago came out. One of the writers on that film said that it wasn't even worth considering when people were talking about diversity. So again, it doesn't lead to a better film. Just as a Caucasian person being put in front of a film. I mean, Tom Cruise, one of the most highly overrated actors on the planet. A white guy doesn't guarantee success. An African American actor doesn't guarantee success. You still have to have a good script. You still have to have a good director. You still have to have a vision. You still have to have good producers. You still have to have a good studio. Diversity doesn't just create a great product, but it does offer representation. And I think the reason that I got into comic books, that I got into pop culture when I was a kid, was, like a lot of people out there, I was an overweight kid. And so, you're going to be a victim of bullying. There are many, many overweight kids that are going to go through the exact same thing. And for the most part, they all come out fine. In fact, they come out a little bit more well-adjusted because you have to rely on a bit of more of a resilient personality. But when I was reading these stories when I was a kid, I was reading Ultimate Spider-Man, and he was a teenager, and I was a teenager, and I could relate to this kid. I could relate to his plight in the same way that I'm sure that there are a lot of other kids out there who are now going to watch Black Panther, and they're seeing themselves on screen, they're seeing themselves represented. And I think we all really appreciate that when you see it in the pop culture sphere, when you see something you enjoy that is indicative of who you are as a person, and it makes absolute perfect sense. So that's my little hot take. That's my little half-hour hot take on the rise of pop culture diversity. Again, this is not coming. I don't have a degree in sociology. I don't have a degree in race relations or racial politics. All I can tell you is my experience as someone who's consumed a lot of pop culture, televisions, movies, comics. The diversity has always been there. It's always been there from the get-go. When sci-fi first started making those small little steps, they were diverse characters. Star Trek is still that trailblazer. I think people forget that, but in the 1960s they were smashing all of those boundaries. And if you broaden your scope, you can see what I'm talking about. You're going to be able to see a lot more examples. I think it's very important that we keep pushing on with the pop culture diversity. Again, though, I think the biggest takeaway is you've kind of got three aspects here. You've got people looking to make money. You've got creators looking to push the boundaries, looking to try and include as many people as possible. I think they're probably the most morally justified. And then you have the other aspect of it, Diversity alone does not make a good product. It never has. There are so many other aspects that go into creating a good product. But diversity doesn't hurt a product either. That is my hot take. I've hoped you enjoyed this podcast, and I've hoped you've enjoyed this stream if you've joined us. And don't forget to check out some of the other stuff from the Modern Meltdown. We have a couple of podcasts each week, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. We have the Modern Meltdown gets released on Friday. We have the TV Breakdown we release on Saturday. That's myself, Tommy Din, and Lindsay Soul. We all talk about TV each week, what shows we're watching at the moment, and we give them reviews. Talking about diversity, we've been reviewing Star Trek Discovery and Black Lightning, so head over to that podcast and have a listen. We also have a podcast hosted by Holly Hunt called Beyond the Words, which is an interview podcast. Writers offer their tips and tricks on how to put together your novel. You can also find us at our home on the web, themodernmeltdown.com. Don't forget to follow us on Twitch. Each week we try and do at least 2 streams, one where I record a podcast, and the other stream is where we sit down and myself and Lindsay go through a computer game together, usually something that I'm not familiar with, and we call that the Filthy Casual versus PC Master Race. That's every Tuesday, 3 p.m. Canberra time. So please join us for those. Just stay safe as always. And hopefully I'll see you again for another podcast. Thank you.